Hi, and welcome to the presentation by Charles Sturt University. I'm Associate Professor David Gray, and this week we'll be discussing the effectiveness of integrated marketing communications programs. The overall objectives, excuse me, are to look at the reasons behind measuring marketing communications, establish some guidelines, look at some alternative methods, and think about some of the unique challenges that we face in measuring IMC programs. You can see there's an overall map when we look at the evaluation process, look at the measures, the synergy, the return on investment. We have a look at some of the arguments for and against evaluation, some of the different kinds of testing mechanisms, and also the measurement process. One of the first things I want to have a look at is the role of emotion in decision making. And in the Belch text, there's a good example of Kmart, which looked at the role of emotion in the decision making process. So the basic problem for Kmart was that its everyday low prices campaign was not successful. And one of the things that they wanted to know was to what extent does the target market actually appreciate this approach to everyday low prices. The ultimate objective of the campaign was to increase market share, and the solution was to, first of all, conduct some market research to identify the rational and emotional drivers. So after a considerable amount of research, the brand managers behind Kmart came up with a big idea. And what they did was to invite 1,000 mothers to a store after hours to guess the different kinds of product prices. And the end result was that it was quite a fun activity. But most of the mothers thought that the prices were much higher than actual. So on the basis of this research, they conducted an IMC program using all the different kinds of media and channels available. And as a result, their customer numbers increased by 3 million and their sales increased by 25 million products during the campaign period. Okay, so we've seen the example of Kmart, but let's have a look at some more recent research, some research conducted by myself and fellow colleagues in the business-to-business area. So what we wanted to know in B2B relationships in particular, do we need a new approach to measuring B2B inter-firm performance, and how do we actually incorporate emotion into the measurement of B2B inter-firm relationship health, and how do we measure the health of a relationship, and also how do we measure inter-firm performance. Now this is an important area because most of the literature over the last 30 years in the B2B area is focused on the rational domain of decision making, and there hasn't been that much research covering the emotional content of involved in B2B relationships. One thing we can talk about is the evolution of actually measuring business-to-business inter-firm performance. There have been a lot of articles over the years, the last 20 or 30 years. And when we look at some of the emotional elements, Morgan and Hunt had a famous article published in the Journal of Marketing in 1994, which covered commitment and trust. It's called the KMV approach, or the Key Mediating Variable approach. Johnson, in 1999, focused on relationship quality. Excuse me. What Helford did in 2002 is looked at the whole concept of market orientation and then focused on inter-firm relationships and drilled down into inter-firm relationships and identified exchange, coordination, conflict resolution, and adaptation as some of the major factors affecting inter-firm performance. Excuse me. Lages in 2005 looked at information sharing, communication quality, long-term orientation and satisfaction. Palmater in 2008 looked at relationship ties between exchange partners. Meissen and Svensson and many others identified commitment, competitive intensity, cooperation, formalization, turbulence, opportunism, and specific assets and trust. So those were just a small selection of some of the research studies which were done over the last 30 years covering B2B relationships. The problem is that all of these approaches in measuring interfirm relationships lack a common language and a set of themes for describing interfirm relationships. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to try and identify a common language, a common approach for strategic alliances and buyer-supply relationships that would make it easier to develop common approaches to intervention. So the whole purpose of this is if we can measure it, if we can track it, if we can see how the trends are going, then we can intervene if there's a problem in any of these relationships. And the same thing applies to communications programs as well. So when we looked at the health of a relationship, we extracted a concept from the field of psychiatry. And this basic concept had been around for the last 20 years or so, and it identified three major components, three major behavioural dimensions of business health for interfirm relationships. The first one related to problem solving and interaction. And these were the skills of the parties involved to negotiate goals, rules and routines, their capacity to adapt to stress, their communication skills, and their ability to resolve conflict. So we know that problem solving and the interaction skills within a relationship are critical to the process. The second major factor relates to the organisation and the structural aspects of the organisation. First of all, the ability to maintain interpersonal roles and subsystem boundaries. In other words, does marketing know what public relations is doing? Are the boundaries clearly defined? Does sales understand the production system or operations, etc.? So then we start to talk about the hierarchical functioning and governance within an organisation. Does everybody know what they're supposed to do, and do they actually do it? And how does power get distributed and controlled, and who is responsible for such power in the organisation process? And the same thing applies for IMC programs. Now, the third element, which is there's very little research on in the B2B area, is the emotional climate. And this talks about the tone and the range of feelings, the quality of caring, the extent to which empathy and involvement and attachment or commitment arise within a relationship. Now, we know that commitment has been studied, but aspects of tone and range of feelings, quality of caring, empathy has not. Also, we look at the emotional climate, looks at the sharing of values, and also with respect and regard. So what we did in this study, we conducted a survey in the United States of more than 500 small to medium-sized businesses. And so what we wanted to do was to look at the influence of the health, which we call the BRHI, the Business Relationship Health Index, the influence of the Business Relationship Health Index on performance and satisfaction, trust and commitment. So if you look at this particular table, essentially we're looking at the regression and the R-squared contributions to performance. So what we find is that in this particular model, where we include business health, relationship health, satisfaction, trust, commitment, and also we looked at the concept of esprit de corps, in other words, the camaraderie, the goodwill that exists within and among the relationship partners, we found that we could explain 60% of relationship performance. Now, when you look at this particular table and you look at the R-squared contribution, you'll see that more than half of the contribution is exhibited by relationship health. And relationship health is much, much stronger than satisfaction. And trust, you'll see, is low, because we know from previous research with Morgan and Hunt that both trust and commitment are mediating variables. So they don't actually drive the end outcome, but you can't run a relationship without having some level of trust and commitment. And esprit de corps has a small influence. So we found with this model that we could predict 60%, or could explain 60% of the performance of an interfirm relationship. Now, the table below looks at the contribution of each of the elements of relationship health to the overall relationship health index. So we see that problem solving has an importance level of about 40%. The organisation and structure, excuse me, has an importance level of nearly 31%, and the emotional climate is at 29%. So you can see that excuse me, problem solving and interaction skills are by far the most important factor, but relationship, the emotional climate in relationships is also fairly important. Okay, so we can see that there are some quite innovative approaches to measuring the effectiveness and the health of relationships. But when we start thinking about the advertising and the marketing communications process, there are essentially 3 stages to develop advertising evaluation. First of all, there's the planning stage, or strategic development, and that's critically as to what happened with the Kmart case study we discussed earlier, where we need to define the problem, make sure we understand the product, make sure we understand the needs of the consumers, and also what competitors are likely to do. So planning is quite important. Once we've completed the planning stage, then we can get into campaign development. And the critical thing here is that we need to be able to pre-test and do some in-market testing to make sure that what we've planned makes sense and will work in a practical implementation process. So this involves refining the message and the channels before and during the implementation. And after the campaign is completed, then we need to evaluate the result of the campaign. So we have some post-campaign evaluation. We also evaluate the campaign against its objectives and its return on investment. So there are many people in Australia over the years who have realised the importance of measurement. We see even Harold Mitchell, who's been involved in media planning and the whole process for more than 50 years. He talks about the single biggest problem facing marketeers since the invention of advertising is how to measure return on investment. And this still remains a problem today. There is no universal agreement as how to measure return on investment. And of course, there's John Wanamaker, one of the initial US retailers back in 1910, who talked about half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. So despite what anybody says, there's no foolproof way of measuring the impact of advertising. Lots of people have different approaches and some work better than others. And you only need to look at the Journal of Advertising and the Journal of Advertising Research to see all of the different kind of approaches which have been taken over the years. So there are many reasons for and against measuring the level of effectiveness for advertising. So why do we need to measure it? Okay, well, if we can measure its effectiveness, we can avoid mistakes. We can also do some scenario planning and look at alternative strategies. And this enables us to increase the efficiency of our programs and just work out if our objectives have been achieved. However, there are many arguments against measuring effectiveness. It often will cost a lot of money in terms of measurement. So whether we have to buy the ratings services, whether we conduct focus groups or online surveys, sometimes we have research problems, and how do we identify what the best way to measure the effectiveness? What kind of questions do we ask? And often we have a disagreement on what to test. One of the areas that this can focus on is that different people in the organisation can have different kinds of objectives. So depending on what department they're in. And also quite often you get the objections from creative personnel. They don't want to have their results measured. They believe that you can't actually measure in the short term or the long term what's happened. And also it takes time, a lot of time to do this. Despite all of these issues against, still, it certainly makes sense. If you don't want to be spending $1 million of your company's money and not be able to show to some extent how effective the spending of that money was. The measurement process, it says, itself focuses on, well, what do we test? We look at the source factors, the variables, the media strategies, and the budget decisions. Once we decide what to test, then we can figure out when to test it. Do we do some pre-testing or some post-testing? Then we need, when we've decided when to test, we need to say, well, where are we going to test? Are we going to conduct some laboratory tests, some field testing, do some traditional market research, and then we need to figure out how to test, what kind of testing guidelines, what are the appropriate tests, and then how to measure the effectiveness of those tests. When we look at the issue of what to test, usually it's a question of what your objectives are. So if you decide that you want to measure the level of awareness, then the test will be quite different than if you want to do some kind of eye tracking study to see what kinds of things consumers are interested when they actually visit stores. And that might be quite different than when someone goes onto a website and perhaps you want to know what things they're looking at first, second, third, etc., which areas that they focus on. So then there are also the source factors. What's the best source of marketing communications? So should you have a spokesperson, a celebrity, a nondescript kind of person? So these are very, very important factors which can also be tested as well. Then there's the testing of the message. So you test the message and also the means by which it's communicated. So you may be looking, does it go through a radio commercial, a television commercial, does it go online, some kind of direct marketing, some kind of incentive program, etc. Then you look at the media strategies. So you're making these media decisions, so whether you decide on radio, television, direct marketing, social media marketing. So the research program needs to be designed to fit in with the media class, the subclass, or the specific vehicles which generate the most effective results. And underlying all this is how much money do you have to spend. So the kind of research that you can undertake will depend on how much money you have. If you don't have enough money, then you might need different kinds of research to track in a different way. So when to test? You can conduct pre-tests, and pre-tests are taken before the campaign is implemented. Or you can do a post-test, measures taken after the ad or the commercial has gone to air. The issue of where? The laboratory tests are designed to test consumer reactions to advertising under controlled conditions. And so you might, even a laboratory such as a focus group, you may bring people in and sit them in front of a computer on looking at a website and using an eye tracking mechanism to test which areas of the website that they look at and what their preferences are and how long they stay in touch. Or you can do some online research. It could be observation. You could record and analyze usage. The use of online panels is very, very popular now, and also very reliable since the increase in internet usage, particularly over the last 5 years or so. You can get an accurate reflection of the profile of the population. They're also very, very quick. You can probably get the results back within 7 to 10 days, and the cost is much, much lower than telephone or face-to-face interviewing. You can also do some field testing, so you can go under natural viewing situations rather than in a laboratory. How to test? Okay, well, how to test talks about providing measurements that are relevant to the objectives. And one of the critical things is that you need to obtain agreement within the organisation and or the testing organisation about how the results will be used in advance. In other words, you need to decide well in advance the basis of the testing process. Also, it's a good idea to have multiple measures to measure performance, not just one single measure in case you've made a mistake. So basically what you're saying is that if I have multiple measures which are trending in the same direction, I can be more confident of the outcome. So you need to look at perhaps ensuring that the copy testing is based on a model of human response to communications. And so making sure that there's some underlying understanding of the theory behind the kind of stimulus and response and the testing process that you're going to conduct. So one of the things you need to look at is how many times are you going to expose the advertising stimulus to the recipient. Usually a single exposure is not enough, and maybe you need multiple exposures to see the influence over time. I suppose the question is, how finished should the copy be? The more finished and more polished it is, the better kind of result that you'll achieve, and the more effective will be the evaluation. You also need to make sure that you introduce controls to avoid biasing effects. So making sure that your target subjects are representative of the market, that you haven't influenced their responses during the testing process. So in this case, it's very easy to throw the respondents off the mark by suggesting something or other and perhaps leading them in terms of their responses. So you also need to be able to demonstrate the reliability and validity of any kind of testing process that you embark upon as well. So there are a lot of things to think about when it comes how to test. So when you talk about testing for a campaign development, there are these 4 stages. First of all, there's the concept generation research. This could be the advertising agency, the creative people in your own organisation getting together, coming up with a concept, conducting some initial research just to see whether the idea makes sense. Then you may go through and do some rough testing. Perhaps you'll do some focus groups, some audience testing with audience monitoring. Then you'll conduct the finished art, and then you'll send it out for commercial testing, and then after the campaign has been launched, you'll do some market testing or post-testing to see if the campaign was as effective as you thought. Now again, the amount of money you have will determine what kind of approach you take to the whole testing regime. So when we talk about concept generation, we're talking about exploring consumers' responses as expressed in words, pictures or symbols. So we expose these alternative concepts to consumers and make sure that these alternative concepts match the characteristics of the target audience. Then we look at their reactions, the way that they react to these alternative concepts, and evaluate each of the concepts, including focus groups, direct questioning, and survey completion. So, for example, if I'm conducting a focus group, the usual size might be anywhere from 8 to 10 people. The focus group might last for anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, depending on the number of concepts to be presented. So we can use a qualitative approach, which, as I said, are the focus groups or in-depth interviews. For example, if people are really hard to reach, it may be better to use an in-depth interview as compared to a focus group. Or we can use a quantitative survey to analyse and present people with various alternatives in an online panel survey. And many of the survey tools available, such as Qualtrics, allow you to easily do this kind of conceptual generation and testing process. There are many different online methods, including iTest, and you can see that the different kinds of testing methods can be used for on-shelf visibility in stores, correct brand recall, likability, persuasion, and this organisation conducts a whole range of testing via the internet. When you get to the rough art, copy and commercial testing, so first of all you might develop some animatic rough sketches, then you'll conduct some rough photographic outlays, and also some live action, just to see how things are going. So you're going through this multiple testing stage, and the whole purpose of going through this progressive testing stage is to make sure you don't make a mistake, that you pick up any errors, any misconceptions early on in the process. When you look at some of the tests, there are comprehension and reaction tests, there are consumer juries to see whether you're on the right track with the kind of copy and artwork, and also maybe perhaps video commercials that you're producing, or YouTube commercials. So this is a fairly important part. When you're testing the finished, for example, print ads, maybe you could use the laboratory method. You could include control ads. The problem is that when you're looking at a whole range of different kinds of ads, sometimes people can get confused, and you really shouldn't be evaluating more than really 5 concepts at a time. Then you're looking at the readability tests, the syllables per 100 words, and even in Microsoft Word there's readability testing, and there might be a range of other factors also considered. And readability could relate to the cultural aspects, the ethnic background, the age factors, educational levels, etc. Then you might do some dummy advertising. So you might distribute it to a random sample of homes, but you can still have biased results. For example, Ipsos's ASI's Next Print Global Copy Testing. It's aimed to help advertisers in copy testing of print advertisers. Essentially, it looks at the main idea communicated, the likes and dislikes, the believability, ad attribute ratings, overall likability. So these are some of the traditional measures which are used in global copy testing. So they can be used in newsstand magazines or Newsweek, but it's more likely that the copy testing will relate to online measures now. Usually the diagnostic measures range from 105 to 150 responsibles. They're highly targeted audiences. and there's standardized scores and specific diagnostics in relation to the kind of measures which I discussed above. So when you're looking at pre-testing the finished digital ads, there are theatre tests. So you look at the change in product preferences, look at their interest and their reaction to commercial, reaction from an objective adjective checklist, looking at different aspects of recall as they go through the commercial, interest in the brand presented, and also interest in the frame-by-frame reactions. And these theatre tests can measure all of this. You can have on-air tests, insertion of ads and TV programs in specific markets, but there are limitations imposed by day after recall, and there are also physiological measures as well. In other words, what happens with the kind of emotional aspects, their heart and heart rate, pulse, etc. Some of the physiological measures are pupil dilation, galvanic skin responses, brain waves, eye tracking. All these kinds of things are pretty standard and used quite often with the testing of commercial copy and online ads. Testing in the marketplace. So when you've implemented your marketing communications program, you still may need to go out and test what happens. If you spend $500,000 on a television ad and it goes into the marketplace and is out there for a month, you really want to know how well it was received. So when you do the pre-test, they're usually on smaller samples. But in post-testing, the samples can be larger. So there could be inquiry test, recognition test, and recall test, and you can read about these in the textbook, and their standard methodologies used by the major research companies to identify these kind of aspects. So when you're looking at market testing of broadcasting, one of the major things is to look at the day after recall test. So you've seen an ad, can you recall it 24 hours later? There's different kinds of measures, persuasive measures. Some of the major market testing organizations use a whole swag of diagnostics. There could be single source tracking or tracking studies to measure, for example, recall over a period of time, and also test marketing to see how the commercials are perceived in different kinds of markets. So some of the tracking studies typically used are tracking market share, penetration rates, gross margin percentage, net profit, response rates. And if we're looking at market share, we might look at unit sales, return on marketing investment. And the difference between return on investment compared with the return on marketing investment is that we take away the costs of the direct cost of marketing, and so that's how we have the return on marketing investment. Operating ratios, we can look at budgeting aspects, and then the gross margin percentage, we can look at the cost per customer acquisition, which can also be an important factor, but sometimes is not that easily measured. So when we also look at tracking studies, we need to make sure that we have our properly defined objectives, they're aligned with sales, we have an adequate sample size, control variables, that we have consistency through the replication of the sampling plan. So in other words, if we pick a particular sample in a pre-test and then conduct it on a different sample in the post-test, no wonder we can expect to get different results. I mean, the ideal is that we have a random sample. Sometimes this is possible, sometimes not, just depending on what it is. So perhaps the idea of having continuous interviewing, that is, it's not seasonal, and this will show us changes in the different evaluation metrics over a period of time. Also measuring the competitors' performance as well, just to see how they're going, to what kind of recall they have in terms of their own advertising and IMC programs. So people use moving averages, statistical analysis, regression analysis, and so there's quite a few things to take into account when you're looking at tracking studies. So when we look at some of the different kinds of alternative measures for communications programs, we have what we call process measures, and this is the audit itself. So we conduct an audit of how a particular IMC program. We can have a look at the synergistic aspects such as media interactions between communication mix elements. We look at the return on investment, and the two major aspects here are looking at the return on the brand investment and also the touch point investment. So at the different moments of truth that people are involved with our product or service, to what extent did the communication program have an effect on those different touch points? And also perhaps some new measures, some new metrics for social media, etc. So some of the new measures, when we look at those used by agencies, we need to make marketing communications as effective as possible. In the media area, we need to improve the value of the medium. The advertiser needs to justify their marketing communications expenditure. And marketing managers and public relations managers and advertising managers, or the combination of all, will be under a lot of pressure unless they can show how effective their IMC programs were. So, and it also needs to be a commonality of common speak, I suppose, a common currency between all these media organisations to make sure that they're all on the same page. So we saw in one of the previous chapters some of the digital touch points. In other words, it's pretty hard to conduct an IMC program if you don't know when is the best time to communicate to your target audience. And there have been a lot of studies conducted looking at when's the best time to reach them, when they're at home or in their car or at work or in a retail environment, etc., and how this progresses during the day. And this is one thing that you need to track. Your target audience, and some of the major advertising and media organisations have copious data points in terms of they know when when are the best time to or what are the best digital touch points during the day or during the week or during the month for any particular campaign. Some of the other measurement topics: how do you isolate the effect of media? And you only need to look at the Journal of Advertising Research or the Journal of Advertising to see that this is still a contentious area and is still an active topic for research. Also looking at cross-media measurement, looking to understand the effects of media, not just independently but in conjunction with other. Looking at some of the aspects of digital platforms, and also looking at the impact of social media. One thing the measurement of social media is pretty good at measuring the numbers of click-throughs and what people do in terms of quantitative measures, but they're not so good at this stage in measuring the qualitative component, whether it's sentiment, looking at textual data which comes out in an unstructured manner. There's still a long way to go in terms of this kind of research. So when we look at the measurement and the effectiveness of social media, first of all, when we look at the concept, we're trying to define what is trying to be accomplished and how we will know if we succeed. Then we define it, design it, deploy it out there, and then go through the various optimization techniques to make sure that we can adjust the program as it moves forward. So overall summary for this particular lecture is we've looked at some of the different ways that we can measure effectiveness. We looked at the influence of some recent research, particularly in the B2B area, in terms of measuring the health of a business-to-business relationship. We know that there aren't enough companies testing their marketing communications, and often this comes down to budgetary requirements. The smaller the company, the harder it is for that organisation to measure the effectiveness of its marketing communications. There are still many problems which exist with current research methodologies. There's a huge variety of research methods which can be used, and it's also critical that these measures are linked to the campaign objectives, and continuously there are new initiatives in the measurement which are being developed over a period of time. That's all for this lecture now. Bye for now, and hope to see you in the future. Thank you.